They say the wind of Galilee still carries secrets that have never been written, as if every grain of dust that touches the feet of pilgrims whispers names that the centuries have tried to erase. Under the scorching sun and the cool shadows of ancient olive trees, there were women who walked beside Jesus not as ordinary followers, but as silent witnesses to a profound mystery, a calling that transcended the weight of the temple and the echo of the priests. Their eyes bore a mixture of devotion and something history has never wanted to admit: courage, influence, and a hidden power that could not be contained in the scrolls of men. They were there when faith became flesh, when tears met miracles, when condemnation mingled with desire and repentance. They saw things no one else saw and kept secrets that still shake the walls of the most imposing churches. They were not fragile saints. They were complex, living, intense women. What if I told you that one of them, Mary Magdalene, carried a forbidden secret that would forever change your thoughts about Christ, about faith, and about the very destiny of humanity? At the end of this video, you will discover what lies hidden beneath centuries of silence and spiritual manipulation. A secret involving Mary Magdalene and other women who not only followed Jesus but also played an active and bold role in the most dangerous movement of their time. A secret that could shake the foundations of your belief and expose what has been deliberately hidden. A pact between devotion, power, and spiritual sensuality. Something so disturbing that for a long time it was considered unspeakable. A secret that could explain why Mary Magdalene has been portrayed in so many ways, from saint to sinner, and why her name still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who dares to truly study her. What you'll hear at the end may make you wonder, what if sacred history wasn't exactly as you've always believed? If the first words already made time seem slower, and each image appears like a forbidden secret being revealed, don't let that feeling escape you. Leave your like as if sealing an ancient scroll before the wind takes the last line written on it. And subscribe now, because the next mysteries are already awakening and wait for no one. Dawn in Galilee isn't as silent as we imagine in books. It pulses with an invisible tension, as if each star were a sentinel bearing witness to a time when empires clashed with faith and blood still stained the stones of Roman roads. The earth smells of dust and salt, for the wind crossing Lake Gennesaret brings with it the flavor of the distant sea and the tears shed in olive groves, where women carry jugs of water balanced on their heads and even heavier secrets on their shoulders. Among these women, some followed a different man, a master who had no palace, no army, no golden crowns, but who attracted glances capable of shattering conventions and shattering invisible walls. He walked barefoot and touched the untouchable, while they walked beside him with silent, firm steps, defying the invisible rules of a society that reserved only the shadows for women. These women were invisible not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Some came from luxurious homes, wearing purple-embroidered linen robes. Others bore the mark of poverty and pain that could not be erased even with ritual baths. All had a motive that went beyond pure faith. There was a restlessness, a flame that was kindled every time. Jesus spoke of a kingdom not confined to the marble columns of Rome, nor the coffers of the Pharisees, but within the hearts of those who dared to believe. They were there when he spoke of forgiveness, when he turned water into wine, and when he looked at Mary Magdalene without condemnation, something the entire world seemed incapable of doing. These women carried expensive perfumes, fine fabrics, memories of nights when they were called sinners, and others when they were revered as almost divine. And most curiously, they were present when men fled, when the closest disciples hesitated, when fear became heavier than faith. The question is, why were they there? Why did some abandon their homes, their possessions, and in some cases, even their names, to follow a man condemned by many as a heretic and seen by others as a liberator? There was something in the gaze of these women that was not just spiritual devotion, but a kind of courage rarely recorded in ancient history. The courage to challenge the most unforgiving structures of their time. They were not just followers, they were witnesses to something much greater, and some of them became an essential part of a narrative that has been rewritten so many times that today it is almost impossible to separate truth from censorship. And among them all, Mary Magdalene stands out as an enigma, a woman portrayed as a sinner, then as a saint, then as a heretic, until she became a symbol of what religious power tried to silence. Do you feel that weight? That chill down your spine at the thought that perhaps the history you know was sculpted more by the hand of men than by divine inspiration? Because with each step taken in this narrative, another layer of silence will be broken, and each fragment of that silence reveals a secret that should not have survived. Perhaps you too feel something strange, as if these stories echo a warning, an ancient call, an invisible nudge urging you not just to watch, but to take a stand. After all, who would control faith if these women had told everything they knew? Comment below. The power of that time was not imposed solely by spears and imperial decrees. It was inscribed in the architecture itself, in the way spaces were designed to intimidate or subjugate. Jerusalem and its surroundings stood like a quilt of brutal contrasts. On one side, Herod's proud palaces, built on hills with columns imported from Rome and cold marble floors that echoed with every step, a reminder of who ruled in a suit. On the other, the narrow, dusty alleys, where the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the sweat of exhausted bodies and the awe of soldiers patrolling past, armor gleaming in the sun. The women who followed Jesus walked through these spaces, and each one seemed designed to remind them of their place, as if the city were a monumental theater, where roles of submission were defined even before they were born. The temple, in turn, was the gravitational center of this architecture of power. Its white walls reflected the sun with an almost divine intensity. Its endless staircases demanded reverence, and its internal organization determined who could approach the sacred and who should remain at a distance. Women were among those who felt this separation most acutely. Many could only remain in the outer court, away from the veil that hid the Holy of Holies, as if God himself were forbidden to them. But beside Jesus, this hierarchy seemed to lose its strength. He crossed invisible boundaries with a naturalness that disturbed the religious leaders and disconcerted the Romans, and in doing so, he also gave them a new space, not physical, but spiritual, that no stone wall could confine. The wealthiest homes displayed power in a more intimate and quiet way. Vast halls adorned with Phoenician tapestries, Greek sculptures, and Roman mosaics formed veritable domestic sanctuaries. Every detail, from the curvature of the amphorae to the designs on the stone floors, symbolized status. The women in these homes, some of whom joined Jesus' movement, carried within them the reflection of their surroundings. Hair perfumed with rare oils, clothes dyed costly purple, finely crafted jewelry. But when they followed him along the dirt roads, the weight of these riches seemed to melt away, as if the very act of walking beside him were a break with that entire aesthetic of domination. This contrast between sacred and profane spaces, between architecture that imprisoned and that which liberated, revealed more than simple social differences. It revealed a profound ideological conflict. On one side, a system that used walls and hierarchies to control bodies and beliefs. On the other, a movement that moved in the open air among fields and hills, touching people who would never be allowed to touch the temple veil. Jesus subverted space, and these women participated in this subversion simply by being there, present, visible, active. And this was dangerous. Every street walked, every house visited, every market where their presence caused murmurs was a reminder that power lay not only in the cold stone of buildings, but in the gaze of those who dared to challenge the established order. When you think about it, you realize how the historical landscape seemed more like a chessboard than a living city. Every space had its purpose. Every wall had its political and spiritual function. But there was something unpredictable about that feminine journey, a kind of fissure in the perfect structure of power. Doesn't it sound almost familiar, as if today we still walk among invisible walls built by hands that claim to be sacred? Desire has always been a silent language, spoken between glances and agreements that are never written down, but which shape entire empires. In those days, the female body was not just flesh and soul. It was a territory of negotiation, a symbol of alliances, and a currency of power. Women from influential families were offered in marriage as if offering a province to the empire, and their presence in certain circles meant much more than beauty or companionship. It was the link that connected clans, cities, and kingdoms in subtle and dangerous agreements. The political environment in which Jesus and those women moved was permeated by this logic, a field where desire and power mingled with devotion and faith. Among the women who followed Jesus, there were those who had lived within this veiled politics. Some had been wives of wealthy men, discreet administrators of estates, mediators in family tensions who, behind closed doors, decided the fate of servants, lands, and even armies. These women's eyes were trained to perceive more than what was said aloud. They could interpret the silence of a host, the tilt of a head, the way a cup was left on the table, signs of who held the advantage in this game of influence. But by choosing to follow Jesus, they gave up participating in this predictable and comfortable game, challenging not only the religious order, but also the unwritten political code that governed their world. Mary Magdalene is perhaps the most intriguing example of this transition. Many texts reduce her to the image of a repentant sinner. Others elevate her as one of the most faithful followers, but few discuss her likely access to social and economic circles that made her far more influential than any simplistic narrative would suggest. If she did indeed come from a wealthy family, as some traditions suggest, her presence near Jesus was not only an act of faith but also a political statement. She abandoned a world where sensuality was used as a tool of diplomacy and entered a space where devotion dissolved hierarchies. And this, to the leaders of the time, felt almost like betrayal. What's interesting is how these female alliances, even when removed from the palace environment, still reflected their subtle power. The women who followed Jesus were not passive shadows. On the contrary, they interceded, spoke with other families, provided financial support, and created networks of solidarity that sustained the movement. It was as if this seemingly fragile and devotional group carried within itself a potential for influence that many armed men could never achieve. The female presence conferred legitimacy in some villages and scandal in others, but in one way or another, it stirred the social structure like an unstoppable undercurrent. When we consider the impact of these alliances, we realize that desire used for centuries as a tool of control was reinterpreted by these women. It was no longer just carnal desire, but the desire for freedom, for justice, for a new spiritual order that placed them not as bargaining chips, but as agents of transformation. Perhaps this is why some apocryphal records and oral traditions insist that Mary Magdalene had a special relationship with Jesus, not necessarily erotic, as so many modern myths propagate, but deeply symbolic, a connection between souls that defied social and religious conventions, a frightening bond, because it demonstrated that faith could generate bonds stronger than any political alliance. It's curious to imagine how those in power would react to seeing these women abandon their traditional roles and embrace such an uncertain cause with no guarantee of protection or status. Perhaps you feel something similar now, the unease of realizing that some alliances are still quietly forming today, changing history while the world looks the other way. What if kingdoms were sewn together not with swords, but with silent glances and whispered promises by lamplight? Comment below. Which of these female alliances do you believe changed the course of history without anyone noticing? In ancient times, feminine gestures and purification rituals were charged with secret meanings, passed down through generations. Perfumes, fabrics, and jewelry functioned as silent messages, expressing purity, readiness, and magnetism. This knowledge gave women a subtle power, capable of influencing without physical force. Following Jesus, they redefined these rituals. Once linked to seduction and politics, they became acts of surrender and spiritual freedom. Mary Magdalene's anointing with spikenard symbolized this fusion of ancestral tradition, implicit sensuality, and the revolutionary message that challenged religious norms. It's strange to think that such subtle practices could redefine destinies and change perceptions of faith and power without a single sword being raised, isn't it? Long before palaces and temples became monuments to male power, there existed a more intimate and more dangerous space, the bedroom. Not just any room, but a meticulously prepared environment to dissolve resistance, create alliances, and seal silent pacts, where desire was as political as any treaty signed at noon in the sunlight. The king's bedroom, or that of any man of authority, was conceived as a microcosm of power. The calculated darkness, the lingering aroma of burnt resins, the soft string music playing in the background, the choice of fabrics that glided like water under the hands. Every detail had a function. Each element was an invitation, a trap, and often a sentence. The women who lived in this context knew this perfectly well. Some of them, before following Jesus, were intimate with these practices, not as victims, but as strategists in a game that gave them some space in a world where almost everything was denied them. They understood that seduction, when orchestrated, became a kind of liturgy, a ritual of enchantment in which the body and soul were tools of persuasion. Light, almost translucent linen fabrics, colorful pillows scattered with rehearsed carelessness, jars of wine seasoned with rare spices, lamps arranged to cast seductive shadows. Nothing was casual. The setting itself spoke louder than words. When these women joined Jesus, there was a cultural and spiritual shock. A man who refused to use someone's body as currency, who spoke of a kingdom without beds of power or alliances made between sheets. Yet this knowledge was not lost. It was transformed. In the movement they embraced, what had once been used to subjugate now served to liberate. And this deeply disturbed those who ruled. How could one control women who knew the innermost workings of power, but chose to relinquish them to follow a faith no one knew quite how to define? There's a little discussed detail. Some of these female followers likely had access to places and people male disciples would never reach. The invitation to private conversation, the ability to move between social strata, to speak with governors' wives, or even high-ranking concubines, quietly opened doors for the nascent movement. While many saw only humble women walking behind a preacher, what was actually happening was the building of invisible bridges made of trust, charisma, and the memory of a power learned between the sheets, but now used for much higher purposes. This explains part of the discomfort of religious and political leaders. It wasn't just Jesus' message that bothered them, but the presence of these women, who carried within themselves the threat of a revolution not only spiritual but symbolic. They had been where power slept, they had heard what power whispered, and now they walked with someone who said the true kingdom was not behind locked doors, but within every heart. Have you ever considered how dangerous it would be for an entire system to realize that the most intimate and controlled place, the king's bedchamber, could become irrelevant in the face of a faith that flourished in open fields? That a word whispered at the foot of a bed could be worth less than a tear dropped at the feet of an itinerant preacher? It's a thought that still sends a shiver down your spine, because it shows that some secrets were never truly locked away. If men fought their battles with swords and spears, women often waged war in silence, moving invisible pieces, manipulating rumors, managing affections as if they were managing kingdoms. Within women's spaces, private chambers, narrow corridors, inner gardens, a different war was waged, more subtle and far more dangerous, for it left not corpses on the ground, but shattered reputations, broken alliances, and futures stolen before they were even born. The concubines, wives, and influential banquet hosts knew this. It was a war where every gesture, every look, every choice of word carried an implicit strategy. Some of the women who followed Jesus came from this world. They knew the silent codes of this struggle, the deliberate choice of a rare perfume, the display of a jewel at a calculated moment, the seemingly innocent comment made to the right person at the right time. In the palace environment, the struggle for position, whether for a longer look from the king or for the most prestigious place at a banquet, could decide not just one night but the fate of generations. This invisible war was as structured as any military campaign, but waged with less visible weapons: beauty, charisma, intrigue, information. Upon joining Jesus's movement, these women found themselves confronted with something disconcerting, a group where traditional hierarchies dissolved, where there was no room for prestige struggles based on appearance or seduction. But the memory of that logic still lingered within them. The clash between their previous learning of survival through manipulation and influence and Jesus' message of equality and service created a silent tension that is rarely discussed. There were indeed veiled rivalries among some followers, especially when Mary Magdalene began to gain prominence, not only as a devotee but as someone close enough to her that rumors, assumptions, and even jealousy arose. The invisible war, however, wasn't necessarily negative. Many of these women transformed their ancient competitive skills into a unique ability to protect the group, negotiate with outsiders, secure resources, and open paths where male disciples encountered resistance. Manipulation, which once served vanity or the desire for power, became a tool for survival and advancement. But the specter of the game of intrigue always loomed large. What if someone used it again against another? What if a woman's presence was deemed too dangerous by other leaders or communities? This subtle conflict reveals something essential, that even within a spiritual movement, the human condition bore its deepest scars. including the competition between women that, centuries later, still echoes in the silent corridors of historical interpretations. Thinking about this raises a disturbing question. Does faith truly free us from these invisible wars, or does it merely shift the battlefield? In the ancient world, children were more than blood ties. They represented living contracts, guarantees, of power and political survival. Bearing an heir could define alliances, succession and status, transforming the female womb into a symbolic arena of disputes. The women who followed Jesus were familiar with this logic, marked by arranged marriages, inheritance disputes, and the social weight of motherhood. Jesus' movement broke with this, valuing women for their faith and dedication, not for the number of children they had. Still, many feared irrelevance without heirs, while others saw children as a chance to preserve a spiritual legacy. Later traditions even speculated about a possible descendant of Mary Magdalene, demonstrating how the idea of continuity haunted even the spiritual. These women, however, broke the cycle by caring for orphans, teaching girls and creating safety nets, ensuring a legacy of hope and faith more lasting than any material inheritance. Do you feel it? The strange mix of human desire for control with the promise of something freer and more untouchable. Perhaps it's because deep down, we still fear losing the future when the present seems so uncertain. When one speaks of ancient faith, one almost always imagines a people united under a single altar, as if each heart beat to the same spiritual cadence. But the reality was much more complex, almost clandestine. The empire's borders were crossed not only by armies and merchants, but by gods, symbols and rituals that traveled hidden in pilgrims' bags, in discreet necklaces, in words murmured in foreign languages during the night. And women were the primary bearers of these silent gods. Coming from distinct regions, they carried memories of different cults, of deities who presided over fertility, harvest, love, war, and even death. These memories were not erased when they crossed the doors of the Jewish temple. They mingled silently in small offerings and hidden whispers. Among the women who followed Jesus, this spiritual baggage was alive. Some brought with them family, traditions that harked back to foreign gods, learned in their grandmother's kitchens or in rituals performed in hidden caves, where firelight painted shadows on faces and chants echoed like ancient spells. Others carried cultural imprints of cosmopolitan cities, where statues of Aphrodite, Isis, or Cybele coexisted with Jewish icons. This forbidden mixture generated tension. What to do when a message as radical as Jesus intersected with ancient traditions, some of which offered women roles of power that official religion denied them? It's possible that part of these women's attraction to Jesus' movement lay precisely in this possibility of fusion. By his side, they didn't need to deny their stories completely, for he didn't demand the destruction of cultural identities. He transformed, redirected, and purified them. But silently, many religious leaders saw this as a dangerous threat, a risk of doctrinal contamination. For them, every reminder of a foreign god was a crack in the wall of their unique and pure faith. Perhaps this is why the figure of Mary Magdalene became so controversial, because she had a past that some associated with the Hellenistic world, or even with foreign religious practices. She represented the fusion of worlds, something as scandalous as it was fascinating. This tension was not insignificant. Imagine its impact in a context where each altar vied for control of the sacred and the political. A movement led by a preacher with no fixed temple, accompanied by women with diverse spiritual backgrounds, was more than an anomaly. It was an act of rebellion against centuries of religious monopoly. And in a way, Jesus' message spoke to this syncretism, not in the sense of accepting it as it was, but of transcending every part of it, uniting everything under a love that did not depend on idols or hierarchies. This meeting of traditions, even silent, was a challenge to the established power. After all, who could control hearts that had already learned to worship in multiple forms? Who could impose a single narrative on those who carried within themselves so many divine stories? Perhaps that's why the silence about these women was so profound in official records. To speak of them would be to admit that the nascent faith was not pure but alive, made of encounters, ruptures, and reconstructions. Have you ever thought about this? That perhaps the religious purity we so often preach is actually a comfortable myth, and that the truly sacred is always born from mixture, from shock, from risk, Pleasure comes at a price, and it almost always arrives too late, when the intoxication of the moment has dissipated and the silence after the party sounds heavier than any war drum. In a society built on rigid hierarchies, where every touch and every look could mean power or ruin, choices made in the name of desire left traces that could never be erased. The women who followed Jesus knew this truth well. Many of them had seen firsthand how a night of passion could decide alliances, inheritances, or the very survival of an entire family. They had seen men lose thrones over a kiss, women driven from noble houses by a misinterpreted rumor, cities fall because trust dissolved between the sheets. This backdrop gave an even more intense tone to Jesus' message, which rejected the logic of pleasure as a bargaining chip and offered a completely different path, a path of surrender, of renunciation, of love that didn't depend on bodies being used as bargaining chips. But not everyone accepted this proposal easily. There was something threatening about a movement that refused to play the established game, a movement that said the body, once used to buy protection or advancement, was now a temple, and temples are not sold, not traded, not used as instruments of manipulation. For some leaders, this was a heresy worse than defying Rome, because if women stopped seeing their bodies as a resource of power and began to see them as an expression of freedom, an entire system based on symbolic and emotional control could collapse. And indeed, this new perspective awakened internal tensions. Some of these women needed to break with deeply ingrained memories and habits, learn to see themselves outside the evaluative gaze of the men of their time, embrace a value that didn't depend on beauty, fertility, or the ability to seduce. This transition was painful, as if each of them had to die to a version of themselves and be born again to another that didn't yet know how to walk. But there were also those who saw the movement itself as an opportunity to revive old patterns of influence. Not everyone who approached Jesus was ready to abandon their old ways of thinking. Intrigues arose, misunderstandings multiplied, and some female alliances, formed around the desire for status or proximity to power, nearly destroyed the core of the group. The lesson was clear and stark. Any profound change disrupts invisible structures, emotional habits that don't disappear overnight. The price of pleasure then was not just individual, but collective. It was the price paid for centuries of cultural conditioning, for a history that taught women to negotiate with their bodies and taught men to buy with promises. And even in the midst of a spiritual revolution, this weight continued to be felt. The frightening thing is that, in a way, this dilemma never disappeared. Even today, power and desire walk hand in hand, masked, elegant, sophisticated yet dangerously familiar. Do you notice this? How the same old plots seem to resurface, as if the world were trapped in a never-ending dance. Official history has attempted to paint these women as mere supporting actors, silent shadows who merely watched events unfold without altering them. But the truth, preserved in nearly erased fragments, whispers of apocryphal gospels and oral histories, reveals something very different. There was a hidden power in the women who followed Jesus, a power that came not from weapons, titles, or riches, but from the ability to move hearts, to create invisible networks, to defy centuries of silence. This power was used to sustain the movement when it was most vulnerable, to carry messages between villages and towns, to hold together a community that could easily have dissolved under political and religious pressure. And Mary Magdalene becomes the center of this mystery, far beyond the historical caricatures of a repentant prostitute or an ethereal saint. She appears as an active leader, a voice heard by Jesus and respected by many disciples. Some say, and here is the revelation so many have tried to silence, that she possessed a secret knowledge, an understanding of Jesus' teachings that went beyond the surface, something transmitted to her in a unique, intimate, and profoundly transformative way. It's not just emotional closeness or friendship, it's a spiritual trust that made her the guardian of truths that, according to some traditions, were not even given to the 12 apostles. This secret, described in some Gnostic texts as the hidden wisdom of Magdalene, suggests that she understood something few dared to face, that the kingdom of God was not a distant throne in the sky, but a flame burning within each person, men and women, without hierarchies, without veils, without mediators. And this, for the religious leaders, was incredibly dangerous. If a woman could carry this knowledge and share it, then the entire power structure built over generations could collapse. That is why, for centuries, her name was tarnished, diluted, silenced, because the truth she carried could not be controlled. The impact of this revelation is brutal. If it is true that Magdalene received a privileged vision, then the history we know has been deliberately shaped to maintain the established order. This forces us to look at faith differently. Was what we were taught a selective construction, shaped by convenience? Or could it be that even today there are silenced voices, secrets buried beneath seemingly unquestionable dogma? Perhaps this is what causes so much discomfort, realizing that the power of these women still echoes, spanning the centuries, calling those who dare to listen to a truth greater than any temple, greater than any hierarchy. The consequence of all this is clear. If these women were able to sustain and expand a revolutionary message with their invisible networks and their quiet courage, then the entire concept of who can and cannot lead in faith needs to be reconsidered. And this is frightening because it breaks with centuries of comfortable narratives. And now that you know of this hidden power, that you have heard the truth that pierced the silence, the question that echoes is inevitable. What are we going to do with this? Ignore it, as so many have done before, or finally admit that sacred history was never as simple as it seemed? If these voices that time has tried to silence still echo in your thoughts, then you already know. Some truths can no longer be hidden. If every word of this story has ignited in you that feeling of being faced with something forbidden, leave your like as if leaving a mark on an ancient stone, and subscribe because the next revelations do not ask for permission to happen. The story that is now emerging on the screen is denser, more disturbing, and may change the way you look at everything you thought you knew. Click. Only if you're ready to go one step further than the official story has dared to show.